Hello, beautiful humans. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast, Quarantine Edition. I am currently recording this in my bedroom because I've been working in my living room all day and I wanted a change of scenery. This is where we're at right now, where I'm changing rooms to try to get a different energy in my life. We're living in wild times. This has become inevitable. It's actually, quite wild how almost every single human in the world is having, of course, very different experiences, but going through this human experience in a very similar way. I think it really reminds us of our connectedness, it reminds us of our togetherness. And anyway, one of the things that I stand for and I really encourage my clients to step into is a place of being gentle with yourself. So in this episode, I thought I would break down what exactly does it mean to be gentle with ourselves? Why be gentle with ourselves? How does that facilitate and help with our healing and processing of stuff, of pain? And what are some practical things that we can do to step into being gentle with ourselves? So let's get into that intro and get into this topic. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Okay. So what does it mean to be gentle with yourself and why is it important? Let's start there. Being gentle with yourself is this idea of cultivating the capacity to be kind towards self. It means to be self-compassionate. Being gentle with yourself means really managing the inner critic and not letting the inner critic go rampant. Because the opposite of being gentle with self, right, is to be harsh with self. And I think we can understand harshness to be the ways in which we speak to ourselves and understand ourselves. It's very critical, very judgmental, very cold, very narrow scope, very limiting. There's a very small width of which we can make mistakes. Low tolerance, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas gentleness, there's a high tolerance. And I think if we take a moment and really think about the people who've been kind to us, because they are kind people, if you think of teachers, mentors in your past, in your childhood, that you feel pretty confident in saying that they're just very kind and they were very kind to you, then you get a better sense of what it means to be kind towards self because these people have exhibited kindness towards you. So it's not that these people let you kind of get away with anything, right? That's one of the myths about self-compassion and being gentle with self, is that if I'm gentle with myself, then I'm going to let myself get away with anything. But I actually haven't found that to be true. I don't think that the sole purpose of our existence is to keep ourselves on hook for all the bad things that we've done and to punish ourselves every time we deviate from this very high narrative, high expectation, right? This very rigid narrative of who we are in the world. I don't know if that's necessarily the point of being human. And the other myth, right, is that we need the inner critic. If we don't have the inner critic, then we don't move forward in the world. And I actually haven't found that to be true either. In fact, I find that the more moralizing and demeaning the inner critic is, the more paralyzed and small I am. And so my actions that then come from that very paralyzed place doesn't encompass the fullness of my experience. And it makes me feel not excited to show up for myself and it doesn't propel me forward. I'm a high achiever. I've always been a high achiever. It's the way that I've learned how to navigate and cope with life, is by being a high achiever. And I haven't found that being gentle with myself has diminished my desire to put myself out there or be strong or whatever, achieve things or be productive, et cetera, et cetera. I find that being gentle with myself, it's like a soft landing space within my heart that I know that I can arrive at any moment and not be greeted with criticism and belittling and judgment. That capacity to land softly in our own hearts then allows us to cultivate empathy for self and others. Being gentle with ourselves allow us to grow from experiences instead of get paralyzed from our mistakes. Being gentle with ourselves teaches us that we're human and that we're limited and that mistakes are an inevitable part of this experience. Right? It's like we don't actually need the inner critic to keep us safe from harm, even though that's exactly what the critic was kind of evolved from, was attempts to manage the pain that was happening on the outside. And now that as we are adults, we get to develop a different relationship with our inner critic, right? The inner critic gets to exist. That's what I always say to my clients. All of these parts of us get to exist. The inner critic, the judgment, the parts of us that want to separate, that want to demean and belittle ourselves, they are allowed to exist. They just don't have to take the steering wheel. They don't have to be the one dictating the show. They don't have to be the one defining our worth or telling us who we are in the world, right? And so I find that being gentle with ourselves, learning to be gentle with ourselves is a process. It's not a destination. We get to discover what that means based on our own experiences. We each get to find what it means to be gentle to ourselves. But again, if we can really reference someone who's been gentle with us and kind with us, we typically want to show up stronger for them and more powerfully for them than with other people who are critical. I haven't seen that if you have a child and you yell at the child and belittle the child and demean the child over and over and over again, that they grow up to be self-confident and expressive and joyous in the world, right? In fact, I find that adults who were treated that way as children are very in a lot of pain and very defended and very constricted and narrow in their lives. So as much as the inner critic may have developed from a deep desire to keep us safe and to prevent us from getting harmed, and that continues to serve its purpose now as adults, I think it's really valid for us to notice that. You can notice the inner critic. You can be aware that you're judging yourself, but then not stay there, not land there, not decide that that is how you want to be, but actually go forward in saying to yourself things like, I am deserving of compassion. I am human. I'm allowed to make mistakes. Being gentle with myself is key to my mental health. Like, I love being gentle with myself. I love being kind to myself. I deserve kindness. I mean, these are all things, right, that we can remind ourselves when we are getting lost in that inner critic to bring us back to what's real, which is that no matter what you have done in the past, you are not deserving of bad things happening now. No matter what you've done in the past, you are still deserving of human dignity from others and from self. You do not have to stay on the hook for the mistakes that you've made 10, 20 years ago. You are allowed to free yourself from the past, and you're allowed to forgive yourself, and you're allowed to move forward. You are allowed to be gentle and kind because you are deserving of gentleness and kindness. You don't have to earn that. That's not something that needs to be earned. That is just a basic human right, and you are human, and therefore it is your right. Clearly, I have a lot of passion when it comes to gentleness and being gentle with ourselves. Because again and again and again, from the women that I work with, there is this harshness to their experience of themselves, and the sense that they have to stay on the hook for their past mistakes or else they'll never learn from them. And again, haven't actually found that to be true. In fact, we tend to learn from mistakes when we are met with gentleness and kindness than when we're met with criticism and harshness. And when we are gentle and kind to ourselves and we receive feedback, and attempt to learn from something, it's not so personal, right? It's not so about us. There's some other myths about being gentle with ourselves, like it's selfish or it's for wimps, like we have to just man up and pull ourselves by the bootstraps and stop like coddling ourselves or babying ourselves. There's that whole narrative, which I think as you hear me say it, it just sounds so patriarchal, and it sounds so devoid of empathy. And I'm just not convinced that anything devoid of empathy is what's going to create a whole human. You can be empathic and bounded, right? Like you can be kind and have boundaries and have clear rules. Being compassionate and a kind person to self and others doesn't mean that, people can walk all over you. That's not what kind is. That's people pleasing. It's a totally different thing. So being gentle with ourselves isn't that we suddenly allow anything to happen. It's that we can see what's happening with the lens of gentleness, with a lens of kindness versus a lens of needing to punish ourselves. Yeah? Okay, let's see my notes here. What else I want to say? So, one of the things that is important to recognize when we're going through something like this global crisis is that crises often elicit old coping skills. That's, any crisis, any trauma, anything big that happens, or small and subtle things, to be honest, things happen and we attempt to figure out how to respond to it. And more times than not, the way we tend to respond to things is through our old coping skills. One of the ways that one quote unquote coping skill that we have learned to prevent us from harm, right, is a hard inner critic. So anytime I have a client who is sharing with me on a consistent basis, like every single day for a couple of days, that they are feeling really, really hard on themselves. They're feeling like they're being really hard on themselves, and they're criticizing every move, and their inner critic is really loud, and they're really being judgmental in everything that they're doing. Whenever that is happening, usually what I'll invite them to do is to slow it down and check out what's happening underneath the surface, because there's probably big feelings that are coming up it's easier to use these old coping strategies like the inner critic than it is to access those bigger emotions. Right? So that is in and of itself being gentle, getting curious as to why the inner critic is becoming so loud and tending instead then to the emotions that are underneath. That's being kind and gentle to ourselves. That's honoring our limitations. That's recognizing that the inner critic is serving a purpose. And then that's getting curious what's happening underneath. That gentleness is much more impactful than judging ourselves for having an inner critic and then feeling really broken and getting stuck and paralyzed there. Right? And so whenever you notice old coping skills come up as you're doing the healing work, there is probably something lurking underneath the surface that needs to be investigated, that needs to be examined. That curiosity, that capacity to be with the complexity of everything that's happening in our internal world, that is being gentle with ourselves. Okay? Let me see what else. So to be gentle means to be loving. Love gets a really weird vibe. We learn really skewed up ways that love manifests as we were growing up. We were taught that love means being manipulated. Love means being gaslighted. Love, if you loved me, you would do this, etc., etc. But that's not what love is. And as we grow up, I think we start to get a deeper sense of what love is. That maybe love is the capacity to hold space for somebody else's complexity without forcing them to be anything different. So maybe that can be extended towards us as well. Like maybe loving ourselves is being able to hold the complexity of all of who we are, the good and the bad, without demanding that we change simply because we want to feel more comfortable. And I think that's why we do so much of it. We want to be skinnier. We want to be more beautiful. We want to have an inner world that is like, happy all the time, because we imagine that that's what, then we would feel comfortable. And we're trying so hard to get to this point where we can feel comfortable with ourselves. But maybe we're not actually supposed to be seeking this comfort with ourselves. Maybe what we're supposed to be seeking is the ability to be with the uncomfortable. And maybe as we seek that out, can you tell that I'm a shadow worker and I love shadow work? As we seek that out, as we seek the capacity to be with our discomfort, and to be with all of the complex things that are happening inside of us, maybe then we expand our capacity to be with ourselves. Maybe that's love. Maybe love is capacity for other people to be who they are, for us to be who we are in all of our messy glory, and to be allowed to be here, to be in the space of that. What do y'all think? Okay, so a couple of tips on how to be gentle with yourself. My favorite thing that I've been examining, and this is a podcast episode that I shared, last week, 2 weeks ago? Let me check it out. Yeah, 2 weeks ago, episode 113, what it really means to slow down. Slowing down is a really helpful tool to pull out pretty much all the time, but particularly when you're noticing yourself not being gentle with yourself. Because that's the first step. The first step is recognizing when you're not being gentle. Because, the inner world, we become kind of accustomed to it. And we don't really ever question our thoughts until we take moments to journal what we're thinking. Slowing it down forces us to actually then examine the thoughts that we're having. And it's like, oh, I'm actually quite mean to myself. Oh, I'm actually meaner to myself at this point than at this point. Oh, this happened and that makes me meaner to myself, right? So becoming aware of our patterns is the way that we start to break patterns. We have to start to learn what is happening in our inner dialogue before we can change our inner dialogue, right? So slowing it down means using the space that you have in your life to fill it with curiosity, with investigation. Journaling is my favorite tool of all times because it forces us to really examine the thoughts that we have, the patterns that we run, what's here, how often do I think this way, what was happening when I felt this way, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so slowing it down. Really important tip. Okay, so tip numero dos, give yourself praise. Self-praise. This is more of a mindset trick than a kind of like a soul shift trick, but mindset's important, and this can be really helpful to, whenever you notice yourself doing something amazing, tell yourself that. Tell yourself, this is amazing. You're doing amazing. Celebrate yourself. When you do what you said you were going to do, celebrate that. Honor that. I mean, that shit's hard. It's hard to be human, y'all. So, we need to be giving ourselves praise as often as possible. I find this to be particularly true because I'm an entrepreneur and I don't have a boss to chide me or to praise me. I don't often get praised, and seeking validation from my clients or people on social media is not the best thing in the world. It's not. I don't want to hook people onto that. So something that I've been doing a lot is committing to self-praise. Whenever I accomplish something, I yes, go you, celebrate me. Celebrating self is just as powerful as the art of celebrating others, right? Which is holding people to that sense of joy that we get to be proud of ourselves and we get to say that to ourselves. Another really kind of important thought or tip on being gentle is to honor your physical needs. I talk a lot about embodiment and the physical body and the importance of feeling our feelings through our body. And part of that is to be attuned to and aware of when our body needs something and to give that to ourselves. This is part of reparenting work. This is part of attunement. This is part of the invitation of being gentle with ourselves, which is if you're hungry, to notice that and eat something. When you're full, notice that and, act on that. If you're feeling the need to move from a room to a room, as silly as that may be, it may be really helpful for you. So honoring physical needs is a great way to ground ourselves in our body, in our existence, in our limitations. If you're feeling sick, take care of yourself. Take the supplements, sleep longer, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Again, this is that sense of care that I talked about in a couple episodes ago. And part of being gentle with ourselves is to be in care of ourselves. So take care of this meat sack, of this body that we have. That is really important. And then the other final kind of tip on being gentle with ourselves is to continually invite ourselves to shift to our experience. So often we're engrossed in how other people are perceiving us, how other people are feeling, are doing, are being. Well, he did this to me and she did this to me. And, we lose ourselves in that versus coming back to, how did I feel what she did? How am I experiencing what she did? What is happening here within me when that happens? Right? Bringing ourselves back to our experience is a part of attuning to ourselves. Again, really important reparenting technique. Bringing ourselves, like land yourself in the middle of your experience. We tend to leave ourselves constantly by focusing on what's happening out there, what's happening with that person and that person and that person. And the opportunity here is to bring it inward to how we're experiencing something, how we're feeling about something, how something has landed within us. This is all part of being gentle with ourselves. Part of being gentle with ourselves is acknowledging that we are a self and that we as a self have needs and have wants and have desires. And then being able to provide that for ourselves, to give that to ourselves, to honor those needs. Being gentle, being loving, being kind to ourselves means allowing ourselves the fullness of the human experience. It means leaning on tools of joy, of tools of kindness, of tools of compassion when we are feeling particularly prickly and mean-spirited towards self. Being gentle with ourselves is a real unique opportunity to remember that empathy trumps everything. Empathy trumps power. Empathy trumps fear. Empathy trumps everything. Empathy is the key to healing. Having someone who is empathically listening to you is a critical process in the healing journey. Having ourselves be empathic to ourselves is a critical part of our healing journey. And so when we tend to ourselves and tend to our needs and honor our needs and give ourselves our needs and tune into what we're experiencing and have the expanding capacity to be with what is within ourselves, things start to feel different. The inner critic stops needing to play that role because there's other parts of yourselves that can play that role. Things get to feel much smoother, nicer, kinder within our hearts when we remember that we are allowed to be gentle to ourselves. And this is everything. This is everything. Okay, so while we're all navigating this really, really difficult, tumultuous time, I hope that you give yourselves so much gentleness, so much compassion. And I'll be posting more about this on Instagram, so stay tuned for that. In the meanwhile, I'm sending you love. I'm sending you compassion. We are in this together. We will get through this together. Let's lean on each other. Let's ask each other for support, and let's do kind things for one another. I'll be thinking of y'all, and I'll catch you next week. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.